and probably one of my favorite type of activities were the can you spot the difference pictures, or what's wrong with this picture? And I think I got one up here. Actually, that goes along with who we're going to be looking at this morning on the series that we're on the book of Judges called Broken Gavels. But remember, you get the pictures, and they look like, from a first glance, a quick glance, they look identical. But then when you look a little bit closer, that you realize that I hear Janet already like, I see this, I see this, I see this. And there's supposed to be a second slide here, but apparently that's, so there you go, okay. Now there's 8, and I only found 6, but I'm gonna just blame it on the quality of the picture. It was a little bit grainy. But again, you're looking at it, and now everybody's just looking. I'm going to find those missing too. I'm going to find it, so I'm always going to pay attention to what I'm saying here. But the idea of this is, from a quick glance, it looks, hey, this picture looks fine, this picture looks normal. But then when you look at it a little bit closer, you're going, something isn't quite right with one of these pictures. Something, they just don't match up. And as we're looking at this book of Judges, that's part of the way in which you're supposed to read the book of Judges. You're reading it and you're looking at the picture which is being portrayed, and you should be going, something is wrong here. Something is not quite right. And at first, it's pretty subtle. But then as you go on, it becomes a lot more obvious. It becomes a lot more like a 2x4. It's like, okay, what seemed like hints of being wrong are now like really, really very wrong. These are some glaring mistakes here. And we're really going to start seeing that in the life of the judge that we're going to look at this morning. This judge is one that we're somewhat familiar, probably one of the most familiar judges in the book of Judges, the judge we call Gideon. And so we're going to look at Gideon's story, at least the first part of Gideon's story this morning. We're going to call this week The Rise of Gideon. You can guess what next Sunday is going to be called. If you think this is the rise of Gideon, next week we'll look at the fall of Gideon. But before we do that, let me just do a quick reminder, quick introduction of this series. First of all, does this book of Judges fit in? What's the time frame? And again, we find it at the beginning of our Bibles. It's the 7th book in the Old Testament. It's shortly after the time of Moses, right after the time of Joshua. Joshua has led them with Moses and Joshua, they've helped lead them out of Egypt into the promised land. They were supposed to drive the inhabitants out. They got about 75-80% and then just kind of quit. Joshua dies. The people are unfaithful. They don't finish the task. And then all of a sudden, there's this period of about 200 to 300 years. We would almost want to call it the Dark Ages. It's very tribal. It's very, very barbaric. And it's before really the rise of the kings of Israel. That's, first was Saul and then David and his dynasty. But it is this sort of interperiod between the kings and after the time of Moses. And it's really a pretty dark time. A couple of things that mark this book is just what is often referred, and Pastor Dave introduced this on the first week, is it bases around this cycle of destruction or cycle of dysfunction. It really is a downward spiral where, again, it begins with this time of peace. And again, this is not the perfect way of saying the cycle, but it does have alliteration, so it helps that way. But it starts out with this time of peace. We call that restoration, which leads to a time of rebellion. The people rebel, but as you read it, it's actually, they never really stop rebelling. They're constantly in rebellion at this time. But as a result, God says, I'm going to send in these outside enemies. They're going to inflict you. And so, again, you've got these outside enemies coming in and enslaving the people. So that's that time of retribution until finally the people can't take anymore. And so they call out God for help. Again, it's sort of the repentance without the repentant. It's just asking for help, but not wishing to change in any way. And we're going to see again that cycle this morning as we look at Gideon. Now, I also wanted to mention that there's 4 things that we should consider as we're going through this book. The first one is that there's 12 judges. And these judges, in fact, they're organized more geographically than they are chronologically. But it's this idea, it's not just giving us this history period, this 200 to 300 period of history, just for history's sake, so we have all this information, but it's organized in a way to teach a lesson. It's really teaches a warning, we do not want to go back there. you do not want to live in the way that the people live there. It is not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for anyone. So again, it's designed in a way to teach. These judges that we meet, this is the second thing, is that each judge seems to be a little bit worse than the previous judge. Up to now, there's been a few hints that say maybe something's not quite with this judge. Hopefully today when we get to Gideon, and I know oftentimes we think of Gideon, we think of him as one of the great heroes, one of those great virtuous people of faith. I'm hoping that I'm going to quash that for you this morning, right? Gideon was not near as idealistic as we sometimes like to think that he is. Third, most judges come along and they rescue these Israelites from the enemy, these outside enemies, these outside nations that have come in. But actually, by the end, the enemy, you realize, is not so much outside, it's from within. They're the ones responsible for the own crisis of their lives. And so what begins as the book is this outside oppression, ends literally in civil war, where they're fighting against one another, right? They're ultimately their own worst enemy. And finally, there's another thing to look for is, where is the tabernacle, right? Where's the house of God, the center of Israel's worship? Where are the Levites? Where's the priest? Where is the religion of the land? It doesn't really actually appear till the very end of the book, but you will see it represented. You're going to see it represented in this story, but you're going to look at it and go, wait a minute, this doesn't sound all that we've taught about, what Moses left us from, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and even with Joshua in the book of Joshua. Where is it? And something has gone very wrong. So those are the things that I want to keep in mind throughout this series. But now let's jump in and look at the story of Gideon. We're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to move. And because this is such a great, and just the narratives in this book are so fantastic, I'm just going to let them speak as much as possible. We're going to go through it, and then I'm going to just pause throughout and give things to point out as we go along. And I'm going to break it down into 5 scenes. And the first scene starts in chapter 6, and we're going to look at verses 1 to 10. And this is that dysfunctional, destructive cycle revisited again. So verse 1 of chapter 6 begins this way. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. So again, you have this thing, they do evil, and now God has turned them over to one of the surrounding nations. And just so you can look, up there where the star is, that's sort of where the majority of the events of the narrative take place. And the Midians, they come from a long way away. They come way down almost near the Red Sea, okay? Almost from this area close to the Sinai Peninsula, so quite a long ways away. But what's most unique is here we have the longest description of the way the Midianites are oppressing the Israelites, and there's something unique about the way this is described. Verse 2, it says this, because of the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Now, what's unique with that description, obviously that's pretty rough, that's pretty harsh, but one of the unique things that if you knew anything about the Midianites, in fact, generally speaking, Israel was in pretty good terms with Midian. That's the place where Moses went after he left Egypt for the first time. That's where he met his wife Zipporah. His father-in-law Jethro was a Midianite. And they were the wanderers. They were the nomadic shepherds. They were the people that would actually kind of not stay in one place, but would go around. They would be the ones who would often live in the caves of the rocks and so forth. And it's almost as though they've switched places. They were probably the ancestors to the modern Bedouins that still kind of live around the Middle East and go around. But it's all of a sudden they've moved in. It's like that bad guest who comes and visits and just doesn't want to leave and takes everything, just empties your fridge. It's like, come on, man. Really? Right? They ate all the leftovers, right? They just took everything. And now it's leaving the Israelites
on the outside. So again, they've got this oppression, and just like old habit, they call out for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian. Now, up to this point, again, you've got this cycle, but every time the cycle is done, there's something that's a little bit changed, a little bit of a shift. Up to this point, whenever, okay, they sin, they do evil, they call out, the bad guys come in, they call out for help, and God just raises up this deliverer, this judge, and he rescues them, and then the cycle starts again, period of peace, and then the cycle starts again. But before we're introduced to this new judge who's going to rescue them, God sends sort of an opening act, a prophet, to warn and to rebuke the people. Again, verse 8, it says this, He sent them a prophet who said, This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt and from the hand of your oppressors. I drove them from before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. Right? If you actually were to go right back to Judges verse 6, or chapter 2 begins with this other messenger, this angel of the Lord, who basically says the exact same thing here. But God says, the reason, before I come in, before I send this deliverer, I want to get one thing very clear. The reason why you're dealing with all this adversity, all these attacks, is because you are worshiping the idols of the land. Okay, so he makes that very clear. Now, one of the things that I should just point out here, because I think it sort of fits a little bit of the world we live in. Now, this book talks about events that happened over 3,000 years ago. And you would like to think that we have just progressed. We don't have a problem with this anymore in the world. But I found it a little bit ironic. I didn't know if anybody saw this week. Last week in the Grammys, there was like a performance in honor of Satan. Did anybody see that last week? It kind of made the news, right? Now, obviously, there's always these kind of performative things, and people are always trying to push the envelopes. And one of the things that's maybe more troubling that they had this performance is that when it was done, they got a complete standing ovation, right? And you kind of think at some point, we think, maybe I shouldn't be applauding the Dark Lord here. Like, maybe we've kind of gone off the rails at some point. But again, these same gods of the Amorites years ago, again, they still the same things that we worship now, right? Power, sex, prosperity, pleasure. That's what they represent, right? Still what consumes us today. So again, here's the warning. And now let's look at this next judge that God is about to raise up. This is Gideon's call, and we'll look at verses 11 to 25. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah, I always want to call it Oprah. Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, The Lord is with you, mighty warriors. Let me just kind of point out just a few quick things. First of all, when we get that word, the angel of the Lord, oftentimes we probably have an image of what an angel looks like. Angel is just the generic term for messenger of God. And so we often think this simply means, white dress, obviously from Scandinavia somewhere. He's, cream cheese bagels and all those kind of things, whatever. But actually, angels in the Bible most often just look like an average person. This probably person came who looked like he was bearing some authority or religious authority, but there's nothing yet in this scene where Gideon knows exactly who the identity of this mysterious visitor is. Again, I want you just to pay attention. The name of the place is Ophrah. That's going to be important, especially as we get to next week. There's a little bit of irony there when this angel calls Gideon a mighty warrior, because we're told he's thrashing out wheat in a winepress, meaning he's terrified of the Midianites. He's hiding. It's about the worst place to do it. But what is most striking is actually Gideon's response. Verse 13, it says this, But sir, Gideon replied, If the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened to us? Where are all the wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned and put us into the hand of Midian. Did you notice what just happened there? He says, you're going to be the next judge. You're the mighty warrior. He's about to explain that to Gideon. And Gideon says, you want to talk about God, but this is all God's fault. Right? What about all those tales of wonder that God used to do? Remember, just before this, there was the messenger of God who warned them, said, this is happening because of this, because of your sin, because of your idolatry. And all of a sudden, this messenger appears to Gideon, and his first response, he goes, this is all God's fault. Now, I want you to read this story and go, maybe Gideon might be complicit in some of the sin, and maybe his family is as we read along. Maybe he's ignoring an important detail that prophet shared. So here's the angel's response. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you? So all of a sudden, this messenger of God says, Gideon, you're going to be the next agent. And I want you to notice something. This is the first time very explicitly that God tells Gideon, you're the man, you're the next deliverer. I'm going to call it affirmation number 1. But I want you to pay attention to how many times God has to remind Gideon, you're my guy, and how many times Gideon puts God to the test. Verse 15, but Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is in the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Now you'll notice in that part I've got a little picture of Pinocchio, right? And I'm going to say that this may sound like humility from Gideon's point, but it is a false humility, that he is not fully telling the truth, and hopefully the details of the story will bear itself. When it says I am the weakest, that might just mean he's the youngest in his family, but I'm going to tell you very flat out that his family is not the weakest in the clan, but is probably the head of the clan, okay? And you will see this very soon. The Lord answered, again, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the mighty Midianites together. So again, that's assurance number 2, okay? You're my guy, and this is how it's going to be done. Now Gideon replied this way, if I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until your return. So he says, okay, I hear it, but I want a little bit of insurance. I'm just going to set up this little offering, this little religious ceremony, and somehow you prepare a sign to let me know that this is from God. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in the basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the yoke. So again, this is, okay, he's got enough stuff for an offering just to whip up like that. I thought in a time when there's being ravaged and there's hardly anything available, where does he have all these means? But it's just going to get a little bit worse from there. Verse 20, the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on the rock, and pour out the broth. And God did so. With the tip of the staff that was in his hand, the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "O sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die." So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Right? So again, just a little note there. I mean, that's pretty wild to just have this all of a sudden, this, and then poof, he's disappeared. But again, you've got a clear sign number 3. You're my guy. I am with you. You got that? Now, this is things where things really get interesting. Remember when Gideon said, I come from a poor family? And remember him saying this was all God's fault? Well, God has a first test for Gideon. He says this, "That same night the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd." Wait, your father has at least 2 bulls? "The one that is 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down his Asherah pole beside it." Wait a minute. It's all God's fault, and you've got an altar to Baal and an Asherah shrine in your own place? And you're saying this is God's fault? There might be some complicit here? Do you get it? Then build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the height, using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down. Offer the second bull as a burnt offering. And again, remember that idea about, we come from the weakest clan? The Abizarites literally translate, my father is the head honcho. My father is the exalted one, is what it means. Okay? He is coming from a significant family with significant power. And this comes a little bit clearer as we continue on and looking at this challenge that God gives Gideon. So again, we'll pick things up at verse 27. So Gideon took 10 of his servants. Wait, I thought Gideon was poor. He's now got 10 servants? And did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the men of his town, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. So the first thing that we learn about Gideon is that he's fearful. He's hiding in a wine press. The next thing he goes, God's using him. You're going to have to be my commander against this invading army. And he's afraid of his family, which apparently is this weak little family, right? And so he's doing it at night. In the morning, when the men of the town got up, there was Baal's altar demolished and the Asherah pole beside it cut down and the second bull sacrificed on the newly built altar. They asked each other, who did this? When they carefully investigated, they were told Gideon, son of Joash, did it. The men of the town demanded of Joash, bring out your son, he must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Again, what's the irony? Where does the story begin? It begins with this prophet of the Lord saying, this is happening to you because you are doing this. You are worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Right? All of a sudden, they tear down the Baal and Asherah in the town at Gideon's house. And are the people there defending Yahweh, Israel's God? Or they're like, what did you do? Put back up the Baal and the Asherah. Why are you replacing it? They're not fighting. They're not standing for God, and they still don't see it. It's God's fault. Do you notice that maybe Gideon's family, Gideon's people might be complicit in the sin that's causing the problem? But Joash replied to the hostile crowd around him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you going to try to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. Doesn't sound like a person who has little authority. Sounds like a pretty strong person. In fact, a lot of commentators suggest that Gideon's dad was probably a priest to Baal, was the local priest. That's why it's at their home. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. So that day they called Gideon Jerubbaal, saying, let Baal contend with him, because he broke down Baal's altar. And as you read the narrative, there's this kind of long connection. Is he Gideon or is he Jerubbaal? Is Jerubbaal sort of an offensive name? Is it putting down Baal or is it raising it up? But Gideon never seems to distance his name from that new title. Now, I just want to point a little archaeological note that's pretty cool. About 3,100 years, about 1100 BC, just recently in the last couple of years, they found a little shard of pottery. And they actually believe that the inscription on it says Jerubbaal. And it comes from close to the same time frame, about 1100 BC is the dating. So that's just kind of a little cool aside from archaeology. Now, you'd think that now Gideon should be ready and prepared to kind of go out and defeat the Midianites, but he has another little challenge for God. He needs a little bit more insurance. Verse 33. Now, the Amalekites and other eastern people joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped at the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Literally, he was clothed in the Spirit of the Lord, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abizarites to follow him. And then he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, Naphtali. Those are different tribes of Israel, that they too went up to meet them. So immediately after there's this destruction of the shrine, people are against Gideon. then the narrative moves along and says now Gideon is kind of, obviously he's risen to a place of leadership, and he's able to bring these people who just a moment ago wanted to kill him to join his forces, as well as rally some of the other tribes with them. Now you think, okay, now they're going to go out and defeat the Midianites. But Gideon is not quite certain yet. He needs still a little bit more insurance. So verse 36, Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowlful of water. Again, that's fourth time now that God has assured him, you're my guy, you're going to be the person who's rescued. So again, Gideon should be in full confidence now. But verse 39, then Gideon said to God, do not be angry with me, let me just make one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece. This time, make the fleece dry and the ground cover with dew. That night God did so, only the fleece was dry, all the ground was covered with dew. So again, now there's assurance number 5. You think he should be getting the point. I love how God doesn't even answer. It's like, okay, whatever by this point. You know, okay, wet fleece, dry fleece, whatever it takes. You want me to hop on one leg, I will do it. Just, you're my guy. What else do you need me to do this? At this point, as we're following along the story, we should be asking ourselves one specific question. Why on earth is God raising this guy up to be the next deliverer? This guy's like a deadbeat chump, right? He's fearful. He's complicit in the sin. He's a problematic person. Now, I have a theory of why God is using and raising up Gideon. And this is this last section in verse 7 that I want us to look to, and it's to ask this question. By who is going to get the victory? Is it going to be Gideon? Is Gideon the one responsible for the victory? Or is God ultimately the one who's going to be responsible for the victory? Verse 1 of chapter 7. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. Now I want you to notice this, right? Just before this, Gideon sets up that test with the fleece, and I'm not recommending that's the way to find out God's will. Should I, do this job? Should I, date this person? Here's these little tests for God to find that out. These are bad examples, okay? That's not the way you do it. But he says this, I'm doing it for this reason, so I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said. But notice how God responds. He says, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. So Gideon, I want something very, very clear. I will use you, and I will deliver the Midianites into your hand, but let's get one thing straight. It is by my hand. And the reason why I'm choosing you is so everybody will know who the victory should be belonged to. And it's me, not you, bud. Okay? That's the way it comes. Now, verse 3, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left while 10,000 remain. Right now, the very first thing we learn about Gideon when he arrives on the street, the one characteristic marks him, is he's a fraidy cat. He's fearful. Now, the first thing that describes them is that they're fearful. You can guys say, okay, if you're afraid, go, and you almost picture Gideon like walking out too, and God's like, not so fast, Gideon, you're staying here. Right? You kind of have that picture. But just like that, the army is cut by 2/3. But then God is not quite done. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Notice that again. I will save you, and I will give them into your hands, but it's going to be me who's doing the saving. Let all the other men go, each to his own place. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites to their tents, but kept 300 who took over the provision and trumpets of others. So this now armed forces is now less than 1% of what originally stood. And again, the reminder, it says, I'm doing it, I'm reducing it down so that people will know that I'm the one who will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Now, again, you think by this time Gideon should get it, but he still doesn't get it. Now, the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley during that night. The Lord said to him, get up, go down against the camp, but I'm going to give it into your hands. Again, God reminds him yet again. And then verse 10, if you are afraid to attack, to go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterwards, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley thick as locusts. Their camels could not more be counted than the sand on the seashore, right? So it's a pretty scary army. I think we would all be afraid. But verse 13, Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such a force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hand. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called up, get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp in your hands. But I don't know, I've almost lost count. I think it's either 6 or 7 times now that he's had to affirm him. And I think it's always really funny, right? God over again, trust me, I'm giving them into you. I'm giving them to you. I'm giving to you. You're my guy. And all of a sudden, one time when it clicks in, he hears random Joe the enemy say, I had a dream about a scary loaf of bread. It's like, okay, now. Don't you love those situations when you're talking to someone and they're like, can you tell, and you give them information, they're like, yes, 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 and then they're like, no, and then they ask somebody else for advice and they're like, oh, why did I think of that? Why didn't I say that? Right, that's like God with Gideon and God like us. It's like, he's being so clear, and then somebody else says, it's like, okay, now I believe it. And then for the very first time, Gideon ends by acknowledging, okay, it's going to be by God's hand that saves us. Now we're going to end it there. We're going to pick up the story of the victory or the battle next week in the aftermath. But one of the questions that will remain is, afterwards, will Gideon give the glory to God in his victory, or will he still claim it for himself? But what are we to do with this story of Gideon? Right? Again, it's another world away. What does it have to do with us? Here's just on a very, very little simple housekeeping note. It's really important to read the Bible and read it well and read it closely. Oftentimes when we think of Gideon, we think of him as this great, wonderful, amazing hero. And all of a sudden, if you actually start looking at it from the detail, you're like, oh, he's not all as great as possible. In fact, it was recently I was in a room of a lot of pastors and ministry staff, and the preacher who was doing, who's a well-respected person, encouraged us all to have the fearless spirit of Gideon. And I thought, have you read the spirit? That's not how I would. Not someone we're here to emulate. But here's where I think Gideon is really important. Right? At the heart of our salvation is we believe it's not us that saves. Right? It's not our own agency. It's God's agency. It's God's hand. Paul in Ephesians says this, the reason why it's not us, because if I make it you, then you're going to be boast. Right? It's about me. And the reason why I picked a chump like Gideon to rescue the people, so that everybody would know it's by my hand and not by his, not by this clown. But here's also a good thing. If we actually look at Gideon, and we can give him a hard time, but he looks a lot like a lot of us, right? He's fearful, check. I'd be fearful if I was in his situation. He's a person who doesn't take responsibility for his own sins, can't see the idolatry within his own household, but is also so quick to blame God. It's not my fault. You, God, you're the one who's abandoned us, right? That's Gideon. And then he also wants to move up his own self-importance. I want to be the hero of the story. And God said, no. You're the anti-hero of the story. I'm the hero of the story. And the question is this. We cannot save ourselves. Because without God's help, we're just Gideons. We're fearful people hiding from the enemy in wine presses. We need God to pick us up from our bootstraps and save us, to help us, to lead us. And then the question that we remind is, when God does that, will we hoard onto the glory, keep onto our own self-importance, or are we going to give it back to God and say, only God, only God? Gideon is the person who God rescues in an incredible way, uses in an incredible way, and Gideon misses the point the whole time and hoards it all to himself. Paul puts it up, and again, this is the heart of our salvation. For it is by grace we have been saved, through faith. And it may take a lot of time, just like Gideon, for us to get that faith to sink in. And that it is not from ourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works. Why? So that none of us have any business boasting. Let's give the glory back to God and follow his way, not our way. And ask the worship team to close the service.